Well, good morning, man. Good morning. Good morning, and welcome to Session 5. We've made it this far. You know, this is 25% through. We're 1/4 there. And we had kind of a roller coaster ride last week. You know, we looked at our wiring, and there's just a chart back up here just to refresh that memory a little bit. But the big dip in the roller coaster last week, and I've talked to a lot of you guys last week right after the session, and this morning I got kind of inundated again, and I got some emails and phone calls and had some meetings this week, was really all around the same thing. And that was from the negative carryovers of our past. These wounds and unfinished business that were just anchoring us down. And there was really kind of two areas, and it's the same ones that we hear over and over and over again. That's not to make light of those that are suffering from those, but it's just to let you know you're not alone. And those areas around your relationship with your father or with your son, but in that father-son relationship area. And then there's also the one that comes over and over again is around divorce. Now, some of you guys got a double dose, and you had a terrible relationship with your father, and you went through a divorce. Some of you guys have delivered both. But the great news is there's victory on the other side of that. And I've lived through that, and it's an amazing thing. And so I just want to keep encouraging, because I heard from guys that shared stories of victory like I've had, and it was great. It was almost like we'd been through a battle together and high-fiving and just kind of telling our own stories to each other. And then there was also guys who are right in the battle, but they're fighting the battle. They're winning some ground, they're losing some ground, but they're trying to figure out ways that they can reconnect with dad, or that they can reconnect with son, or try to restore what was lost, because they don't want it to come into their future. But I think the most powerful thing was the guys I heard from that last week, they finally decided that they were not going to live in denial anymore, that wound didn't exist. They weren't going to just stuff it like they've been doing, because they finally said, I'm not going to drag that anchor through the rest of my life, just bouncing behind me, slowing me down and hitting everybody around me just randomly in the wake and doing some of the same damage that was done to me. And the guys that have just bucked up and said, I'm going to deal with this now, and I've got other guys in my life that are going to help me, like Tim was talking about, deal with this. And I just say, you guys are on the adventure, because that's part of the great adventure, is getting our wiring cleared up. And that's what we did last week. We mainly wanted to make sure, we didn't clear it all up last week, we wanted to make sure you understood where all of those things in your life fit, your past, your present, your future, and even how your birth and design is playing a role today. And then I promised last week that we were going to begin with the end in mind. And that's what we're starting, this 3-week journey of the end in mind this week. And that's all the way out to death. And so today we got to go a little bit into the death zone. You know, in the mountaineering world, there's a thing called the death zone. And when you get up climbing tall peaks, when you get around, depending on the latitude, when you get around 24,000 feet, your body starts to die. No matter how much oxygen or food or water or warmth that you have with you, there's nothing you can do for your body to survive at that altitude, and you just slowly start to die. So you can't stay there long. You go into the death zone, but you have to go there, because going through the death zone is the way to the summit. And so for the next 3 weeks, we're going to go to the death zone a little bit, and we're not going to die there. Some of y'all may feel like it on a moment or two, but we are going to get to the summit. And so we need to go there. And we're just going to call this, rather than the death zone, this is really sacred ground that we're going to call it. And when we're talking about sacred ground, we need to understand that living a life that is in the right direction, that's oriented to our end, to our death and even our eternity, that's a powerful drive in men. You guys know that. I've shared some studies with you about how even those 50,000 college students knew that having a correct purpose in life was their number one goal. And psychologist William Sheldon tells us that exact thing when he says, deeper and more fundamental than sexuality, deeper than the cravings for social power, deeper still than even the desire for possessions, there is a more generalized and universal craving in every human makeup. It's the craving for knowledge of right direction, for orientation. And I don't think that surprises y'all because we all feel that. What I want to do is to make sure we're clear on how we're going to get that right direction. We're not going to get the right direction by looking back, though that's going to influence us. We're going to get the right direction by looking forward. And that's what Stephen Covey says. And I read part of this quote last week, but I want to reiterate it again. In his 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. And the second habit is to begin with the end in mind. And here's why he says it's so important. To begin with the end in mind means to start with a clear understanding of your destination. It means to know where you are going so that you can better understand where you are now and what steps are always in the right direction. That's why we're doing this. That's why it's worth it. And it's going to be an incredible journey that I think you'll actually enjoy, and it's going to have a great outcome, because getting your steps in the right direction is important. A couple of famous episodes in the annals of football history is when a guy has gotten his direction wrong, picked up the ball, got turned around somehow, and took off for the end zone. Gets to the end zone, he's excited, and he's doing a little dance because he scored, only to find out that he got a little misoriented and ran to the wrong end zone. That was actually done in the Rose Bowl once, and one of the most famous ones with Jim Marshall did that. Part of the Minnesota Vikings' famous purple people eaters. And he got turned around, picked up a fumble, and ran 66 yards in the wrong direction, was celebrating, and he says, when you read the story, he says, "Man, I was just as happy as you could be until the guy on the other team came and gave me a big hug. I knew something wasn't right." And that play goes down, if you look it up in NFL history, it's actually listed as the shortest play scoring play in NFL history at a minus 66 yards. But what that shows is just how sometimes when we think we're scoring, when we think we're getting to the end zone, we're in the wrong end zone. We're scoring points for the wrong team. Rather than 6 points for our team, we're scoring 2 points for the other team. And we don't want to live a life like that, because the guys that have done that, what you've all felt in all of them, even if it was for a short time, there was a lot of shame and just feeling like a fool when they ran to the wrong end zone. And we don't want to live a life like that. And so if we would say what we're going to need to do, looking at all our wiring, past, present, and future, and said we needed to take an oath about what we're going to commit to this year, I just say, here's our Adventure Sacred Oath. And it just simply says that I will fervently live my life according to my design, and Tim's going to help us a lot with that in the second half of the year, with the end in mind. I will fervently, passionately, energetically live my life. I'm going to go for it. According to my design, though, not just at any end zone, with the end zone that's the right end zone for me to go for. Now, to do that, to get to the right end zone, we have to talk about some metaphysical stuff here this morning. And I would just equate metaphysical kind of with peripheral vision. The word itself just literally means beyond the physical. Because if we're going out into the death zone, if we're going out into beyond what's this life, obviously we're gone beyond the physical. And that's what metaphysical simply means. And I would say it's kind of like peripheral vision. And it's not the things we're focused on and we can see real clearly, but they're there and they're influencing us. And if we're not careful, they could take us out. We've said we wanted to be great adventurers. It's the name of this entire year, The Great Adventure. Well, what do we say about all great running backs? What's the one thing that's just kind of the intangible that they always say about them? They've got great, what? Peripheral vision. And so as a great adventurer, to be a great running back, you need great peripheral vision. To be a great adventurer, you need great peripheral vision. And our peripheral vision is to be understanding clearly the metaphysical, what's beyond the physical. And so today I'm going to show you, first of all, two worldviews. And if you really took all of human thought, for the most part, took all of human thought and boiled them down, you could really come up with two worldviews. And a worldview is simply just kind of how you see the world, how you believe that it works, the things that you think are real, the things you think are not real. And it's really kind of what you're going to bet your life on if you really wanted to look at it in a tangible way. And there's really just kind of two large general worldviews, and I'll just call them this morning the traditional religious worldview and the secular scientism worldview. Now, let me explain those just a little bit. The traditional religious, that's the worldview that's kind of come down throughout history through cultures and civilizations and through religions, a lot of ancient wisdom and thought in those. Now, just because these worldviews exist doesn't mean they're right. I'm not saying one's right and one's wrong. What I'm saying is those two worldviews exist. The secular scientism is a worldview that has really been developed over kind of the last 200 years as we've had a lot of different thoughts and thinkings and some of the things that we've learned in science. Now, I'm very careful to call this scientism, not science, because we're not putting science against religion, because I think those two things aren't opposed to each other. I think one enlightens the other. But scientism, when somebody steps over the line of fact and proof, and they move into what they would like to be true, and they kind of say, we're going to believe this whether the evidence fully supports it or not. That's more on what scientism, because science is a pure journey of discovery whose ultimate goal is just to discover the true nature of the world. And I don't know if I seem a little excited this morning, but I tell you, I actually am excited about this talk. And just to tell you why, I can tell you a little bit about my journey just a little bit. When I started in academics, I started out as a serious scientist. I was a mathematician and a physicist, and I loved that stuff. And I was interested in the subject, and I really enjoyed learning that. But let me tell you, when I look back on that, and I even knew that then, one of the reasons I loved it more than anything else, because math and physics was all about black and white. I knew when the answer was right, or I knew when the answer was wrong. But there was no gray area. There was no teacher that could say, well, I just don't like that answer. And I hated that. I wanted to be able to say, it's right or it's wrong. No gray. I don't like the color gray. And so I was just happily going along, working my way through that, studying, doing well in academia. And then I started getting into upper level math and physics. And if you've done that, you start running into things like imaginary numbers and the Heisenberg uncertainty principle. And you run into things that, frankly, not are just a little bit gray, they're a lot more gray than they are black and white. And that rocked my world. And I'm telling you, it rocked my world, because I thought I was going to be able to go out and live my life, and I would always know when something was right and something was wrong. And if it was in that gray world, well, that was just for people that weren't smart enough to figure out what was right and what was wrong. There was an arrogance about that. Frankly, I was basing my life on that. And when I found out the things that I had bet on were as gray as anything else out there, man, it rocked my world. So much so that I said, well, if you can't know absolutely what's right and what's wrong, I better go get some help for that. And so the next semester I started signing up for philosophy and theology classes and dove into that world and found out that there is gray in that world, but there's also some black and white in that world. And it was a great thing to learn to live in the gray. And I'll tell you what I think the word for the gray is a little bit more in just a second. But when you're in the science world, they step into the gray and they call it, they go as far as the evidence will lead them. And then they'll step past that to try to move the black and white line forward. They step into the gray, and they do that in a very noble way. They call it a hypothesis or a theory or a postulate. Something that they say, the evidence leads us here, but we think that the truth is out here, so we're going to follow that. But they're very intellectually honest. Science is intellectually honest about that and says, we're just going to try that. This is a theorem. We're not proving that. And that's the difference between science and scientism, because whether you're an atheist scientist or a devout Christian, when you believe something to be true, okay, you believe something to be true beyond the weight of the evidence, then you've got to call that what it is. Science or religion, you got to call that what it is. It's faith. And that's the word I believe is the better word for the gray that I was describing earlier. We live a life of faith, and there's gray everywhere, which gives us an incredible opportunity to have faith about so many things. Faith has led scientists to incredible discoveries when they stepped out in faith in what they thought they were believing, and they just went for it, and it proved itself to be true. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. But I can tell you there is no greater adventure that you'll live in this life, because remember, that's what we're talking about, the great adventure. There's no greater adventure you'll live than to be a man of faith. It just doesn't get any better than that. And so That's what we want to do. We don't want to end up where we close our minds to what could be. You know, we watched the church, well, we didn't. Some of y'all did, maybe, yeah. We watched the church do this a long time ago when Copernican theory came around that basically just said that the solar system revolves around the sun rather than the earth. And the church, not having evidence to refute that, but they didn't like the consequences of it because it shook everything about what they believed about the Bible, they thought, and these things. So they chose to be closed-minded. And they did a lot of damage because of that. They chose to be that way. And they got shown a fool. There's still people that throw that up in the face of the church. I hear that all the time. Oh, well, the church, you know, they persecuted Galileo and Copernicus. And they're right. But it was a huge embarrassment. Do you know that one of everybody's favorite scientists, Albert Einstein, closed his mind at one place in his career around quantum mechanics? And it really stood as an embarrassment to him. People will throw that at Einstein and go, well, because Einstein didn't want to believe some of the ramifications he thought existed around quantum mechanics. Now, all that's been resolved since then, but what I'm saying is there's a danger of closing your mind and saying that the evidence takes me here, but because my mind's closed, I'm going to say the evidence takes me here. And so that's what I mean when I talk about scientism. And I want to hold both sides to be an intellectually accurate, intellectually consistent. Arthur Peacock, if you want to see this play out, this quote from Arthur Peacock, I'll show you this exactly. He just says, in my youth, I was an agnostic. He didn't know what to believe. But as I did research, I was terribly impressed that the universe was intelligible. So why does nature always turn out to be more intellectually coherent than anything we could conceive before we do the studies? I now believe the universe is rational because there is a super rational being behind it. Now, he's done both things in there. He's put some black and white and he's put some gray, but he's been real honest about it. He said he sees rational things, order in the universe. He sees design, right? And then he says, he can prove it because he says, I now believe because of what I see that the universe is rational because there's a super rational being. He says, I see design, so I'm going to step out in faith and say, I believe there's a designer. You see the difference between that? He's being real intellectually honest there, and that's a great thing to do. And there's a lot of scientists that do that around the world. And what we want to do is just look at the two worldviews when people are intellectually honest, kind of where they come down. The first, and we're going to look at 5 kind of points of these two different worldviews so you can understand them real clearly, what is, what isn't. 4 of these points are distinctives. They're different between the two. And 1 is a similarity. They're identical between the two. So let's look at the first one. The first one just says, the traditional religious worldview says human beings are the less derived from the more. Now, we've been talking about that. We're created by God in His image. Clearly, He's greater and we're less, okay? Now, the secular scientism worldview, though, says that human beings are the more who have been derived from the less. Nothing in the universe is more intelligent than us. We're this magnificent accident of random chance. You know, that's actually one of the underlying tenets of Darwinism. Darwinism says that things of lesser complexity evolve into things of greater complexity. And because they look at human being and says it's the most complex organism in the universe, it's the most evolved, it's the greater. Okay, so the greater, we have evolved from the lesser. The second distinction, in the traditional religious view, assumes what we can see and measure is secondary to what we cannot see and measure. And then just the opposite, the secular scientism assumes that what we can see and measure is primary, if not exclusive, to what we cannot see. So one saying what's in the here and now, what we can see is greater. That's the secular scientism. The traditional religious is saying, no, what is greater is what we can't see. And the Apostle Paul would just be real clear on not only the distinction, but where he comes down on that. In 2 Corinthians, he says, while we look not at the things which are seen, but at the things which are not seen. So he's clearly seeing that there's both. For the things which are seen are temporal, but the things which are not seen are eternal. So he's saying the things that are not seen are obviously greater because they're eternal. They're not temporary. Our third distinction, the traditional religious worldview allows for the fulfillment of one of the strongest desires and anticipations of the human heart. And what is that? We mentioned that a couple of weeks ago. That's the longing for eternity. You know, Ecclesiastes says that God has set eternity in all men's hearts. And this worldview simply allows for the fulfillment of that. Everyone that goes out and does the study, anthropologists, historians, they look at every civilization that's ever been on the planet, and what they see about every single one is they all had some powerful desire to deal with eternity. Okay, they all recognize there's that longing in the heart. But one worldview says there'll be a fulfillment of that longing, and the other one, the secular scientism, simply denies the fulfillment of that eternal longing. They both agree that longing exists, it's just what's going to happen with it. And C.S. Lewis would propose this as what would happen to it. He says this, it's a fairly long quote, but follow with me, he makes a good point. He said, creatures are not born with desires unless satisfaction for those desires exists. A baby feels hunger? Well, there is such a thing as food. A duckling wants to swim. Well, there is such a thing as water. Men feel sexual desire. Well, there is such a thing as sex. If I find in myself a desire which no experience in this world can satisfy, the most probable explanation is that I was made for another world. If none of my earthly pleasures satisfy it, that does not prove that the universe is a fraud. Probably earthly pleasures were never meant to satisfy it, but only to arouse it, to suggest the real thing. So the traditional worldview would say that we have this desire for eternity because eternity is there. The secular scientism worldview would simply say we have this desire for eternity, period. The fourth distinction, the traditional religious worldview points to a meaningful continuance to our lives after death. So not only is there an eternity, but there's meaning in the eternity. And for those who believe, a happy continuance. The secular scientism worldview points to a meaningless ending to our lives. Just says, that's it. You know, if you kind of went to William Shakespeare line out of Macbeth, you'd get exactly what he meant when he said, life's a tale told by an idiot, signifying nothing. If the end of the world is just meaningless, that's what you've got. Now the fifth point that I want to point out is not a distinction between the two. It's where the two worldviews are identical, because both worldviews are embraced by faith. To believe the traditional worldview takes faith. I told you I wasn't going to prove to you guys these exist today, because it takes faith. To believe the secular worldview takes faith, right? It's a faith world. If I could get nothing out of this morning but get you excited about living a life of faith in all kinds of ways, I would have made great progress, because a life of faith is a life of joy and freedom and just exploring the unknown and being surprised and just there's just a wonderful place out there in the gray. That world that I never wanted to go, I found is an incredible world. Well, now we have these two worldviews. So what do you do? Because he said we're going to go into the death zone a little bit, talk about death. Well, out of these two worldviews falls four choices that you could say, this is what I believe about the end. This is what I choose to believe about the end. You have four possible choices. Now, one of those falls underneath the secular scientism. It leaves you with one choice. And underneath the traditional religious worldview, you have three possible choices. The first choice under secular scientism, the only choice, is just pretty much the obvious, dead end. If there is no eternity, if there's nothing after it, it's pretty much the end is the end. It's the old, Porky Pig finishing the cartoon. That's all, folks. And that's all that there's left. It's the only choice. Steven Weinberg, who's a Nobel laureate in physics, gets this perfectly when he writes these words about this worldview. He says, the more the universe seems comprehensible, the more it seems pointless. Life has no happy ending. Life just has an ending and a big period in this worldview. Okay? Being very honest about what that worldview means. In the traditional religious worldview, we have three options, three choices about what happens at death, what we want to believe about that. The first one is just blind optimists. It's not the end, and everything will be okay. You know, I can't tell you why, I'm just going to believe it's going to be okay. We've seen that just recently with the death of Michael Jackson. You know, Michael Jackson, incredibly talented guy, and when he dies, his friends and family and his fans start just expressing their grief in all kinds of ways. And one of the ways we saw this blind optimism. You know, if you saw some of the posters they left out of his house or had on signs as Michael Jackson's in a better place, Michael Jackson's in that great rock and roll band in the sky. We've heard so many different sex and drug craze rockers attributed to. And they weren't not going to tell you why. They don't want to know why. They just are blindly optimistic that they're okay. The second choice is the I'm good enough choice, which says it's not the end, but I'll be okay because I'm good enough. Now, when you step over that line into saying it's not just blind optimism, but I'm going to be okay because I'm good enough, you're saying this, and guys, you need to be real clear on this. When you're saying I'm good enough, you're saying by definition that there's some that aren't going to be good enough. Okay? You're not just blindly optimistic. Everybody goes to a better place. You're saying some do and some don't. And Time Magazine, realizing that, did a poll, a large poll of America, and published the results in their magazine around this question. And it was, do you believe in a literal hell? I was actually shocked by the response. 80% of Americans said they believe in a literal hell. Not life after death, but a literal hell. And then they followed up and said, do you think you're going there? And 95% of the people said, no, I'm not going there. So what they're saying is that 80% of the people believe that there is a very unpleasant place, a place of torment and anguish. They call it hell at the end of this life for those who aren't good enough. And there's a better place, there's a heaven for those that are good enough. And in between the two of those, so what that's saying is at some point when I die, there's a pass-fail test that I'm about to take. And if I pass, I go to heaven. If I fail, I go to hell. And that's just the reality of the situation. In that dilemma, because people really feel that, they feel that there's got to be a meaning afterwards. We talked about that. And if you feel there's a meaning, you're going to feel that there's some type of judgment and even reason why one person would get in one or the other. And that's where religions have stepped in throughout history, because what religions do is they offer you a formula, a process, guidelines on how, on that day of your death, when you take that test, how you can pass it. That's what religions offer. Every religion offers to help you pass that test, except for one. And they do that in a lot of different ways, so that when you end your life, you're not in this ambiguity. If I ask everybody in here, who's going to hell? All right, if we all just put on our list, who do we know is going to hell? Because I'm not going to hell. I'm just not. I'm good enough. I've seen some of you guys. I've seen how you lived your life. You may want to study for that test a little bit. But I'm going to heaven. But who do we all know is going to hell? Hitler. Exactly. And who do we all know? Because if Hitler doesn't go to hell, what's the point? And who do we all know is going to heaven? Mother Teresa, right? I heard that. Exactly, because if Mother Teresa's not going to heaven, we're all going to hell. All right? The question, though, is somewhere in between there, between Hitler and Mother Teresa, is a pass-fail line. Where is that line? And where do you stand in relation to it? If the line is a C, I just need to get a C to get into heaven. Am I at a C minus or a C plus right now? Or am I into the B world? Or am I in an F and I need to cram for the final exam? That's kind of what religions offer for us to be able to do that. You know, Buddhism talks about the 8 right paths. Mormonism has their own rules and things to get you there. Islam talks about the 5 tenets of Islam. Judaism, we're all familiar with the 10 Commandments, and there's other sects of Judaism that have different formulas. But there's one religion, though, that says no matter what you do, you're not going to be good enough. You're just not going to be good enough. And that brings us to the last option. And that option is, I need help. I'm not going to pass this test. I need help. It's not the end. And I'm uncertain and uneasy. So if I could get some help, I'd sure take it. Now, guys, this is the Christian option. There's only one religion that offers that option, and it's the big thing. It's the thing that distincts Christianity from all other religions. Because you know what, Christianity does not offer to help you take that test. It says there's going to be a test. Oh yeah, don't get that wrong. There is going to be a test, and there is a heaven and there is a hell, but it doesn't offer to help you take that test. It doesn't. Christianity offers to take the test for you. It's an incredible thing. Do you know that the Bible doesn't say good people go to heaven? Jesus didn't say good people go to heaven. He didn't. There's not good enough. You can't be good enough to go to heaven. He said forgiven people go to heaven. And that's the Christian option. And we're going to look at that over the next few weeks. But specifically, we're going to look at what heaven looks like. So if we're going to do all this effort and give our lives in a direction that would get us there, shouldn't we at least know if we want to go there? Right? Because I know a lot of people, what you've heard about heaven, they sit on a cloud, we wear a robe, got wings, we play a harp forever. Some of you guys, when you hear that, you kind of think, now tell me what hell's like. Because that sounds like hell. Maybe I should go check hell out for a while and at least see if they got some football games or something, some Division III reruns. Anything could be better than sitting on a cloud, right? Well, here's the thing. The Bible, that's just a terrible picture that just gets put out there, this real infantile vision of what heaven really is. Because heaven, let me tell you, as an adventurer, when you see what the Bible says about heaven, man, it stirs inside of you. And that's why people who know what heaven really is, they have an eager anticipation to get there. Because it, as great an adventure is on this life and this world, it's just a hint of the adventure that waits for us out into eternity. And that's what we're going to look at specifically next week. So you don't want to miss that. Now let me just finish with some final thoughts. I'm going to kind of run through these. First, and I've said this, and I've said this, and I've said this, an adventure always lives with the end in mind. Are you starting to see that? You're never going to be on the adventure if you don't have a clear picture of the end. And only with a clear and decisive view of the end can we do these three things. Now, guys, just put your pens down for a second, because there's a bunch of stuff about to come up here that needs to be filled in your workbook. It's in the back of the book. Remember the answer in the back book? I'm just going to run through these real quick. First, with a view of the end, we'll pursue a life with a balanced and healthy perspective. We'll leave behind a satisfying legacy, and we'll be ready and confident about eternity. Second, man has never done well when his belief goes no further than his life. When you look at history, you just see that man not doing well, whether it proves it or not, man doesn't do well when he doesn't believe that there's something more than this life. And Forbes magazine was curious about that. And so back in the roaring 90s when everything was booming, their 75th anniversary edition came out, and they asked poets and writers and other folks, philosophers, to answer the question, why Americans feel so bad when we have it so good. And this was back when everything was clicking on all cylinders. And they wanted to know that. And one of the people they asked was Peggy Noonan. And Peggy Noonan is a speechwriter for Ronald Reagan, She was a correspondent for Dan Rather, was a good writer. And so she answered the question, why Americans feel so bad when we have it so good this way. I believe it is because our ancestors believed in two worlds, and they understand this world to be the solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short one. We are the first generation of man that actually expected to find happiness here on earth. And our search for it has caused much unhappiness. The reason? If you do not believe in another higher world, if you believe only in the flat material world around you, and if you believe that this is your only chance for happiness, if that is what you believe, then you are not disappointed when the world does not give you a good measure of its riches. You're not disappointed. You are in despair. You guys feel that? She's talking about the two worlds, one seen and one unseen. And when you bet your life on just this one, it's going to end in despair, which is our next point. Avoiding conclusions about the end is essentially a vote for a now-only lifestyle. So you can't just say, I'm not going to think about it. That's you saying, this is all that exists, this world. And what that ends in, it eventually dead ends in frustration and unnecessary regrets. And let me tell you what it ends in the day you take your last breath, because I've been there. It ends in a whole lot of fear. Because you just lived for now. You just said, I don't feel like considering the gray. Just give me the black and white. The last thought here, if there is more to this life than death, if there is more to this life than death, then we should do all we can to understand what's next, right? That's just a smart thing to do. And that's what we'll do next week. Well, let me finish this morning, though. That's next week. Let me finish this morning with a story. And it's a story about a trip I took last year. Scott mentioned it a little bit. It's where he tried to kill me. I don't know what he slipped in my food, but we got that. And Tim came on that trip with me, too. And there was a point on the trip where Tim and I were driving from the big city in Rwanda, which is Kigali, and we were going along the road to the second largest city, Musanze. And it's about a 2-hour drive in an incredibly beautiful country. That winding roads through mountains and hills, there's farmland everywhere you can see, and really narrow roads, a lot of people walking on the roads, a lot of steep drop-offs. I mean, it's a pretty amazing and wild road as you're going. And if you make that drive at night, once you leave Kigali for 2 hours before you show up in Musanze, you won't see one light. Nothing. It's black and as dark as you can imagine anything. It's like a cave you're going along there. And then about a half hour before you get to Musanze, about an hour and a half in the trip, out of nowhere, it's lit up like a Christmas tree. There's street lights. There's businesses. There's homes that you can see lights inside of, and you're shocked. I mean, the first time we saw it, we thought, well, this has got to be a major intersection, or what town is here? And our driver just said, no town, no road, Girard. Girard? Girard. And we stopped there. We pulled in there and to go to the bathroom and to see if we could get something to drink, because we saw there was a little store there. And we started looking around, and we could see that this was had commerce and had business and industry. And I'm telling you guys, there was nothing but mud huts in all directions for hours in all directions. And this place is just coming alive. And part of the reason that we're over in Rwanda is to try to help them do economic development and bring some of the, some economic development to their world, so they don't go from meal to meal worrying about if they're going to starve and be in poverty and their children dying of disease and those kind of things and not being educated. We're trying to help develop that country. And so when we saw this, we thought, well, let's find out how they did this, because we want to replicate this or help this, pour fuel on this fire and get it going, because this is an amazing thing. This is exactly what we're trying to do. So we started asking around what was going on here, who ran all this, and we just kept hearing Girard. So we finally said, guys, this is going to be irresponsible. We got to try to meet Girard and see what he's doing. And so we asked the guys, we said, is Girard here? Could we meet him? And yeah, we think he's here. We could go find him. And so they took us into this restaurant that was there, part of this campus that they had. And we're sitting around the table, and they were real hospitable, brought us some cold drinks and things. And then we're sitting around just kind of laughing a little bit, going, I wonder what Gerard's going to be like. And we're thinking the Godfather's about to walk in, and this icon of industry, and he's just going to have his army with him, and we're having all these third world kind of things running through our head. And in walks Gerard, this quiet, humble, really kind of just unassuming man, and he sits down at the table. Well, now we're really intrigued. We thought it's just going to be a go-getter and he got her done, but that wasn't what we were seeing. And Gerard started telling us his story. And he started telling a story of growing up in poverty with nothing, on the verge of starvation his entire life, watching siblings and friends die because they didn't have the couple of dollars for the malaria cure or another medicine, never having a home, and always wanting those things. And so he started a little business as a young man, making beignets. Some of us know those as kind of little delicacy donuts. Well, in Rwanda, a beignet is a ball of dough fried in grease. It's, kind of like an Arkansas State Fair thing. And they just fry that thing. And I've had one of those. They're not sweet. They're not salty. It's just kind of a bland ball of dough fried in grease. But the Rwandans love them. They don't have a lot of things, especially fried foods. And so he started to do well, and his business started to grow, and he started to sell other things and even bake some breads and some other things like that. And then he started to make some juice. He got some produce from the local market and started squeezing the local fruits into juices and selling those in just whatever container that he could get, in jars and things like that. And that built up enough to where he invested in the machinery to press more juice and to bottle it into bottles. And his business took off, and so farmers started to be able to bring their fruit in. So he made pineapple juice, and he made passion fruit juice. And then he branched into making hot sauce. In Rwanda, hot sauce is called pili pili, which I think just means hot. And these little yellow peppers, they just cook down into this oil. It is hot. Some of the best hot sauce I've ever had. And Gerard makes the best of the best. And then he built a sawmill, so he could take the local timber and turn it into lumber to build homes. And he started a furniture factory so that he could make benches and tables and chairs and beds, just the most basic of furniture that you can imagine that people needed. And all of that stuff was doing well. And he kind of told us that somewhere in that success, he was able to fulfill his life dream because he had a clear vision of what his end was. And that life dream was to have a home for his family. And in Rwanda, that's really kind of a glorified mud hut. And then beyond that, to be able to provide food for his family so they wouldn't starve. And to provide medicine when his kids got sick. And then to have a few extra dollars a year to be able to send his kids to school and get an education like he never had. And that was always his dream. And he got his dream. And frankly, he got that, and he had the opportunity for so much more. And so we heard this incredible rags to riches story. Now, we've all heard those stories before. And they're great stories. They're inspiring. We were kind of just mesmerized by this story because it really was just an amazing journey. He'd gone from rags to riches, from starvation to where he was. And then he told us the second half of the story. And we went from being mesmerized to being blown away. Because when he got success, he didn't do, frankly, what I did in my life, and I know there's some guys here that have done in their life. When you got what you always wanted or dreamed and said this was going to be enough, it wasn't enough. And so now it was the bigger house, or the more prestigious school for my kids, or the nicer car, clothes, or whatever it was, but it wasn't enough. But for Gerard, it was enough. And so he turned his focus to his community and his village. And his focus was, how can I get there, what I dreamed for my family, and it came true, to come true for their family. And he dug in around that. And now his business, he directly employs 500 people. He indirectly provides livelihood for the surrounding farmers, 20,000 people. He provides livelihood for because of his businesses. So much so that they were able to now send their kids to school, but there weren't enough schools. So Gerard reached into his own pocket and he built some more schools and hired the teachers. And then he saw what electricity could bring. And this is what started this whole story, why we were drawn, because we saw the electricity, which isn't anywhere. And out of his own pocket, he put the electricity and the street lights and the generators and the things he needed to do that. He brought light to that community, way beyond visible light. He brought the light of hope to that community. And he did that because he had the true end in mind, not just the end in this life, but the end in the next life. So no matter how poor you are, no matter how young you are, if you have a vision like we've been talking about, guys, it's way beyond you, you can do some unbelievable things. Here's the journey that Gerard went on. The journey of the 4 S's, I call it. The first S was survival. And he had to just survive, and he did that. And then he moved to the second S, which is the S of success. And he got that. And guys, that's the one that takes so many of us out. But it didn't take Gerard out, because Gerard moved on to the next S of significance. He wasn't satisfied with success. He wanted significance. And let me tell you, when you're providing the livelihood, the life and death livelihood for over 20,000 people, that's why we went there. Gerard, it's Gerard. And he was just spoke of with reverence and joy. They lit up when they mentioned his name. And let me tell you how Gerard's going to finish his life. He's going to finish his life with that 4th S that we all long for. And the one that Abraham had. Because at the end of his life, Gerard is going to be satisfied with life. Tim?